Okay, now we're going to talk about constructor functions. Okay, so in many different object-oriented type languages, you may be familiar with the new keyword. Use the new keyword and you instantiate, in most programming languages that are like this would be a class, a person class. In JavaScript, there is no, originally there was no class type of object. Everything was a function. Now they have since added the class syntax, but it's syntactic sugar, and under the hood it gets translated down to a function name, right? So when we're creating these objects, these are called constructor functions, and they have the concept is similar to classes where you are creating an object, right? So these constructor functions, you want to make sure you capitalize, just like you would in most programming languages where you use classes. You would want to capitalize the class name. Again, this is just a regular old function though. And then when you want to create one of those objects from that constructor function, we're going to create a person, and we're going to say new person, right? And then we pass in the parameters or the argument values Alice and Allison, and the first one goes into the parameter first, and the second argument goes into the parameter last. And then what we do inside of this constructor function, you'll see we'll use the this context, right? This keyword. All right. So whenever we are inside of a constructor function, this refers to the object that is being created by this new keyword. So every single time we run this is going to create a new person, and this will be the context of that new object being created. So in this way, we can add property names and set values there. Okay, so first here is referring to this parameter, and here first is just a property name that's being attached to this new object. So this dot first equals first, this dot last equals last. So we're basically creating an object with two properties on it. Pretty simple. So we can run this. We first have to declare a variable to store our new person in, right? And so this executes. We pass in Alice, Allison. This is the new object. So JavaScript basically creates a new object right away, and it's associated with this keyword, and then we add these additional things to it. But by default, the new object, JavaScript already adds a bunch of stuff onto it. So it's a standard JavaScript object, and then we make additions to it here. Okay. So we can just run this. We can say node and 3 constructor functions. So Alice, Allison. So we see that works fine. There's no real problems with that. So let's talk about binding in the context of a constructor function. Okay, so first thing we can do is we can have the unbound method that we're used to, right? So we can paste this in here. We have an unbound method, and we're just using the plain old this context, and we are referencing this inside of the method. It's just a normal function, this inside of the method. So this these keywords inside of the method are going to reference whatever object this method is attached to. So this method is also attached to this right now, right? But later we could attach this function to some other object. So right now these two thises are the same context, okay? But if I were to move, just like we did previously, we moved a method from Alice to Bob, and then the method that was moved to Bob, even though it originated from Alice, this still referred to Bob. Right, so you can see the last video for some of that. So let's take a look at this, and we want to kind of do our print function like we did before. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in here so it's a little bit easier. This is exactly what we did the last time. If you want to see how we constructed this last time, go to the previous video. It just makes it easier to print some things out. So we're going to say alice.print. Okay, and now we're going to take a look and see what we have. Okay, so we have Alice, get full name unbound, Alice Allison. All right, that is correct. Now let's find another way to make a function in this context using a constructor method. We talked about the wrapper method before, and this is a little different in the constructor function context. You will see this a lot in professional code bases. A lot of times some of the older code bases will have this, but it's a perfectly legitimate way of doing things. What we're doing here is we're binding via a wrapper function, but what we're doing is we're storing this into a variable. Now, what does that do for us? This is evaluated when JavaScript is executing line by line. So this is evaluated to a particular context. In this case, this context is our particular object that we are creating. So now we're storing that object in self, okay? So we can reference self inside of the wrapper function, okay? So notice that this is no longer the this keyword, so JavaScript isn't going to do anything special with it. We've already stored the content, the context that we want in this self variable, okay? So in this way, this eliminates having to deal with switching contexts. If I move this function to another object, then JavaScript's going to evaluate this differently. Right here, self is always going to be the original context because we stored it in a variable when we first created the object. Right, so self is always going to be this object. So this is a way to bind, to always bind a method to a particular object. And this is really common. You'll see this all the time in code bases. Newer code bases, maybe not so much, but you will see it. All right. So let's take a look at that and see if that works like we think. All right. So we run this and we've got Alice Allison. So that's nice. The only difference here is we use sort of the template string. We talked about that last time. $, curly brackets. You have a JavaScript expression inside, and that gets evaluated, and then the value of that is injected into the string where the curly brackets are. All right, and then same for over here. So this is an actual string space character, right? And these are JavaScript expressions. All right, so that's not so bad. But now let's take a look. We want to have we want to create Bob, but we want to try to move. We want to try to prove that this context here is sticking to Alice. Where over here, if we move this method over to Bob, this should print out Bob's stuff. So we need to add some extra stuff down here for Bob. So let's take a look at these two. Okay, so I'm making a new person. So let Bob, we're using the new keyword, and this is our constructor function. Now again, constructor function is just a function, all right? The difference is when you use it with a new keyword, JavaScript creates a brand new object, and the references to this inside of that constructor function are references to that newly created object, and then you can add additional things to it. So you can kind of see how this is very similar to most languages, the idea of a class, right? You have a class, and then this is basically just the constructor, and you're adding properties and methods on top of it, okay? So you see we don't really need the concept of a class, and we'll go more in depth of all the different types of variables and static variables and private variables and that stuff. But you don't technically need classes in JavaScript at all. It's just syntactic sugar for people who come from that sort of world. All right, so here what we're doing is we've created Bob, and we have this is Alice's get full name unbound. Right, so we're kind of namespacing this a little bit. This is all just one identifier, one property name, but the underscore doesn't mean anything other than I'm designated that this is actually Alice's. We're getting this method from Alice. It's not the one on Bob because I don't want to overwrite Bob's. Right, and then the same thing here. We're getting the full name wrapper, but this is Alice's full name wrapper. Okay, so this is the one that we should actually see Alice Allison, right? Because this one should be binding to Alice, because when we created the object Alice, we stored this in self, and so when this function runs, it's referencing self. It still has access to this variable that we ran in the constructor function. Okay, so this is interesting. The fact the constructor function executes, it still has references to things inside of it. Okay, so we created this variable inside the context of this function, right? This is called a closure. So there's a variable scoping system in JavaScript such that inside of a function you have basically a series of identifiers. It's an area where you can store variables and things. So inside of this function, self is being stored inside of this function, and when we call these methods still have access to the scope of this constructor function. So it still has access to self. Okay, hopefully that made sense. So let's run this again. We need to run bob.print though. Okay, so remember, console.log is how we print things in JavaScript, but this print method is just a function that we attach to the object. Okay. All right, we run this again, and we see for Bob Roberts, the unbound method for Bob, the wrapper method for Bob, both should show Bob's name. That's true. Then we have the unbound method for Alice, right? And we notice this did not bind to Alice. It switched over to Bob, right? Because it's unbound. That's the expected behavior. And then this next one, though, the context of this was saved in the variable self. Okay, so this is the wrapper version of when you use a constructor function. This is sort of how you would bind self, or one way to do it. Okay. What else can we do binding wise? All right, so we can always use the dot bind method. All right, so we can we have a bound method via the dot bind function. So this is that comment's not correct. This is just using the dot bind that we used before. You basically take a function, and all functions are objects in JavaScript, so they have an attached dot bind method. That method will take in the object, and it's what you want this method, what's the object you want this method to always refer to when it encounters the this keyword. All right, so this part's a little bit confusing because the object we want it to bind to is this, right? So that means the this in this context, right? It would be the same as if I said, since I've already set self equal to this, I could say self here. All right, I want you to take some time to really think about this, what's happening and why that makes sense, okay? Remember, it's a special keyword. Okay, it's not a variable, it's not an identifier. It's a special keyword, and the behavior is different than practically everything else. So whenever this is evaluated, there are rules. And so it eventually evaluates to an object, right? So when we use it in this context, this is whatever the context it would be up here, right? In this function. So it would be this, right? It would be this. The this in this context is whatever we're using this for inside of our constructor function. All right. But the way this works is Node or JavaScript scans this and returns the object. So there's an actual object here, and this gets bound to the object, not the this keyword. Okay. So this is how we're using this a lot. It's very difficult to not use this, but that's how this works here. Okay, so we're binding to an object, and it would be the same since we already stored this in self. We could just bind to self as well. That's another way of doing it. But this, in this particular usage, refers to the new object that's being created, right? This used here also refers to the new person object being created. And then this, in this context, also refers to the new person object being created. So all three of these usages of this are the exact same context. And it's going to bind this function onto the person object being created. All right. So you'll see this a lot as well. All right, let's test that one. And we want to check to see if Alice's transfers over or not. So it should be bound. So we want to see, what did we call this one? This is the full name bind. right? So let's do that. Bob Alice underscore get full name bind, and this is Alice's get full name bind. So that's just this new one that we created here. All right, run this one. So sure enough, this one did indeed bind to Alice, even though it's now on Bob, right? This is a method on Bob. Our print function is going through all of the methods attached to our object and calling them, right? That's what this does. So we're grabbing each one of these methods and calling it. And this is proof that since we called this method, even though it's attached to Bob here, we're getting Alice's information back. Now this probably won't make sense if you did not watch the previous video. So watch the previous video on bind. Okay. All right. What's the other way you can bind in this constructor function context? Okay. So there's a shortcut for doing some of this. In a more recent version of JavaScript, or a JavaScript update, they introduced the fat arrow function syntax. Okay, so the fat arrow is basically creating a function like this. All right, so you have basically your property name, your identifier, and you set it equal to, just like you would set it equal to, function. Right, we could get rid of the fat arrow syntax, and that's completely reasonable thing to do, right? But the difference is this is a shorthand, so it's a little bit shorter to type, and you can create functions very quickly. The other thing it does is it guarantees that this in the function definition is replaced by the context of whatever this is on the outside. Okay, so in constructor functions, this on the outside of a method refers to the new object being created. And that's what each one of these refer to. It's the new person object being created. So what we're saying is with the fat arrow, instead of the this keyword, we're binding that to whatever this is out here right away. So we don't have to do any special syntax. We don't have to do something like this. We don't have to do any special store this in a variable and use a wrapper function. Okay, so it does this for us automatically. And again, the key is this inside the function matches this outside the function. All right, and this is important because of the way that's defined, you can't use fat arrow functions in object literal definition. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in a second. Okay. All right, so that's the full name fat arrow function. Let's test that with Alice. Okay, get full name fat arrow, get full name fat arrow. All right, so we've got Bob, and we're attaching additional functions from Alice. And this is the fat arrow, and we will see that sure enough, even with the fat arrow syntax, we did achieve binding, which is what we wanted. And realistically, most of the time, binding is what you want. And most you'll find when you're developing, that is what most people think should happen when they create one of these objects. It's kind of interesting that JavaScript was designed in such a way that that's not the default, right? But JavaScript was actually developed really, really quickly. I think it took like 7 days or something like that for the very first version of JavaScript. So there's a whole lot it was a very simple, elegant language, and then a whole lot has been added to it. All right. So at any rate, that's binding within the constructor function. And I did want to mention one more thing about the fat arrow. So we were just talking about this, where the fat arrow function will not work inside when used inside of an object literal. Okay, so let's take a look at this last little bit here. Okay, so what I have here, we cannot use fat arrow syntax, and that's because this will be bound to the outer context as you are creating the object. So remember, with the fat arrow function, the this context refers to the same this that is out here, right? And we haven't yet created this object. We're in the process of creating this object. So if you remember from the video 1 with object literals, it's the same reason why you can't do something like this. Full name, colon, I can't do this here, right? Because this is not yet defined. I haven't even defined this object. So this in this context, it's not in a method. So it refers to the outer context, whatever this is in the outer context. In the outer context, it appears to be the global scope, right? So that's going to be the global scope, and you say dot first, and that's undefined because the global scope doesn't have a first property. It doesn't have a last property. So it's going to say undefined, undefined. Same here with the fat arrow syntax. And that's kind of unfortunate because it feels kind of nice if we could do something like this, but we're going to get the exact same problem of that we encountered when we tried to do something like this. It's going to be undefined space undefined. All right. So we can test that real quick. And here we've got Carlisle, but we see when we run the get full name, that's undefined, undefined. Now, why did print still work? Right, we were able to access this. We were able to access the this of first and this of last, and even the last usage of this still referenced the object and the function. So why did it work in this case and not this case? It's because we didn't use the fat arrow syntax. Okay, the fat arrow syntax has a special method of binding this. Fat arrow syntax binds the method's internal usages of this to whatever they are outside the method. Here, this is just a normal function, and the binding of this is whatever that function happens to be attached to. So in this case, that function is attached to Carl, so this is just sort of the standard usage of this. Okay, so that's constructor functions, and you can add private variables pretty easily. All you would need is, just a variable inside here, let a, and this is a private variable. Why is it private? Because if I have an instance of this object, anything that's attached to the object, like dot first, I can access. This is just a variable that's declared inside this scope. So any of my methods in here can reference a. They can set a, they can get a, but I can't do it after I've created the object. So this is essentially a private variable. Okay, and almost all of the common classical programming paradigms you can do in JavaScript. It's just you have to write it just a little bit different. And the reality is that the class syntax for JavaScript is it just translates down to this type of syntax anyway. So the class syntax is just syntactical sugar. It's just so people can use it and it looks similar to other classical programming languages. All right, so that's good enough for now. We'll talk about a couple things. We have one more video before we get to using classes, and we'll show basically the same stuff here. But we're going to do classes instead of the constructor function. All right, that's good enough for now. Thanks for watching.